Hello, everyone. I hope you're all happy and healthy along with your respected families wherever you're located on this God's green earth. Welcome to today's episode of Real Talks with Amini. I'm honored to have Mr. Akshobh Giridharadas, a journalist by profession, a geopolitical analyst, and a frequent contributor to publications in India, in the United States, around the world, and a keen observer of the situation in Afghanistan. So we'll be discussing with him the current situation in Afghanistan and what the future holds for Afghanistan-India relationship, for Afghanistan-US-India relationship, and so on. So welcome, Akshobh. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you. Maybe we can start by having a description of the situation in Afghanistan. How do you define the current situation in Afghanistan under the Taliban regime?
Yeah, no, firstly, Sadiq, thank you for having me. It's me who should be grateful for the opportunity that you've given me. I am truly am grateful. And Happy New Year to you. Unfortunately, it's not exactly been a Happy New Year for a lot of Afghans back in Afghanistan since the Taliban took over and became again the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. Fundamentally, in a lot of ways, you'd have to look at it in the city that you and I live in, Washington, D.C., that the United States and the military industrial complex spent trillions of dollars to replace the Taliban with the Taliban. I mean, and as we approach the new year, it's almost like the same old situation for Afghanistan because Taliban 2.0. There was all this talk about what Taliban 2.0 would be, and Taliban 2.0 is Taliban 1 on steroids. And I think if Hollywood tells us something, right, the sequel's always going to be worse than the original. And what Taliban 2.0 now has, that Taliban 1.0 didn't have in the 1990s, is social media and access to smartphones. So that makes it more potent. On one hand, it allows more international observers a view into it, but it's not like anything was alien. I don't think the Taliban were very subtle with that PR machinery. They were very open about the kind of Sharia law they wanted to impose, the kind of draconian dogmatic laws they believed for a lot of women and especially minorities. And I think it's a very somber occasion because in 2021, just as the first year of the Biden administration was, finished, and in that summer when everything just fell and collapsed. I mean, of course, as an Afghan yourself and very intimately familiar with Afghanistan, better than most people that I know, the situation was very despondent because there was a sense of hope and prosperity that was sort of coming with Afghanistan for many years, a sense of rebuilding, and now it just seems to have undone that and gone right back. So the situation for me is one that we're going to see continuously this form of authoritarianism, this form of draconian, set of principles, a sense of economic morass that will just go back and reverse to what perhaps you'll see in the 1990s. And fundamentally, all of this means a humanitarian crisis. And when you have all of that, it becomes a big security cesspool. Like, I mean, you're going to have groups that emerge that splinter groups from everything else. And we also saw in the first few weeks when the Taliban came back, you were ISIS Khorasan very much there. And fundamentally, I've known someone who's, lost family through IED blast in Afghanistan, the situation, volatility. And I think that's a very despondent situation, Sadiq. But, you already know that so well as someone who's, Afghan, who's seen the situation and, you could have predicted it before it even happened.
Yeah. And how do you assess India's role in Afghanistan? India has been one of the longest allies and friends of Afghanistan, and there's civilization relationship and so much cultural relationship, trade-wise, and so there's a lot of history there. But August 15, 2021, all of a sudden we saw a shift in India's approach towards Afghanistan, where they start cutting off all of their contacts and relationships with their previous allies and shifted over towards engaging the Taliban. How do you see that evolved in the past 3.5 years?
It's a very interesting question, Sadiq, and I think we can, almost write books on this. I want to go back to a time when I think I was in high school. I remember reading a chapter called Kabuliwala, the stories of the famous lentil sellers and fruit sellers that from Kabul selling in India, and the story of that. Because historically, when it was British India, when no such thing as Pakistan existed, Afghanistan and in India were neighbors. And people forget that the reason Afghanistan is also called Graveyard Empires is because of the many, many empires that tried to conquer it. The British failed, never was successful. And ergo, there was these very wonderful photos of checkpoints in 1934, British India and Afghanistan. And along that, as we talk about in the 21st century connectivity, the Grand Trunk Road historically, I think, goes back to the Indus Valley. Even from the Indus Valley civilization, there have been historical linkages. And since the Grand Trunk Road, since the days of post Alexander the Great and Ashoka and the Maurya empires, that road goes from today, like again, erstwhile British India, Bangladesh, all the way on the east, via India, via Pakistan, into Afghanistan. So that trade, that spice trade, was very much prevalent. And Afghans also relied on it because Afghanistan is such a rugged terrain that some of the stuff couldn't grow there. So they relied on, things coming from the fertile soils of Punjab in India. And I think that relationship was always one of fondness. It was there. The relationship with Afghans and Indian people go way back in time. As you know very well, Sadiq, even when the Afghanistan fell into the Soviet hands, but in '79 and in the early '90s, India was one of the few countries to recognize Afghanistan. Of course, when there was a civil war after the Najibullah government fell as well, India, of course, recalibrated because there was a sense of the Pakistan axis coming in. And this is a good time to note that India is one of the largest donors in Afghanistan. And I think it's the fifth largest donor globally, somewhere in the approximately 3 billion. And a lot of people in the West don't understand because there's still a hagiographic notion of India still being a poor country. Of course, that's fundamentally true, but it's also a $5 trillion economy. And one of that, in all developing economies, has also been a sense of assistance towards other countries in the global South. And India has provided an assistance to Afghanistan, particularly in rebuilding of schools and colleges that the Taliban had wrecked. Especially with a lot of dams with hydroelectric powers, because Afghanistan is an arid country, and scholarship for a lot of Afghan students in India. Medical tourism, which India is very well popular for. Even at the height of India-Pakistan strife, there were a lot of medical tourism coming from Pakistan, and Afghans too have benefited from it as well. We living in the US complain about healthcare being expensive, and sometimes you realize how much you get good quality healthcare in India at a fraction of the price. And more importantly, as a cricket lover, both of us, just helping Afghanistan get back into cricket. Of course, Pakistan too, a lot of the Afghan players were in refugee camps in Pakistan, played their trade in Pakistan. But, the BCCI playing cricket with Afghanistan, getting them into the forefront. Rashid Khan is so well loved in India, star in the IPL. So there's a soft power diplomacy. And fundamentally in the 1990s, the relationship between India and Afghanistan changed because of the Taliban government. So India looked at Afghanistan that time with a security concern because of the Pakistan element. Today, there's still a security concern, but today it's a little more with the China element because China is all about building linkages through the BRI. And Afghanistan being rich in all the critical minerals of lithium, iron, cobalt, zinc means it's very rife for China. So there's also that concern. The two things I want to add here, Sadiq, is there was strategic depth and strategic autonomy. Strategic depth from Pakistan's perspective. Because the belief, if you read all the documents of the Pakistani military, right from the 50s and 60s, because of the bloody partition, there was a worry that, India is going to come in and take over. So the belief was, even when there are documents about Operation Cold Start, they were like, no, we need depth because Pakistan is a very narrow country relative to, compared to India, obviously. So the belief that Afghanistan has a strategic depth. And India's foreign policy has always been, as you know very well, Sadiq, strategic autonomy. That non-aligned movement never really went away. It's sort of morphed into strategic autonomy. So I think India engaging right now the Taliban is puzzling for some, but there is method in the madness because it's a 25-year détente, 25-year thawing of the relationship because India didn't have any relationship with the erstwhile Taliban. I think only 3 countries did, Pakistan, UAE, and Saudi Arabia. And of course, Pakistan played this policy, as we know very well, to put it very simply, good terror and bad terror. Musharraf complained about the Tehrik-e Taliban and the Pakistan Taliban attacking, Pakistan, but they used the Afghan Taliban for strategic depth. And I think since that period, people forget, just to go back to my, dating myself a little, when I was in school, I remember this very clearly, that India got acquainted with the Taliban long before the world heard the Taliban, because we live in a far more sophisticated era right now. But long before 9/11, long before the world knew Al-Qaeda or Osama bin Laden, India got into the Taliban through the IC-814 hijack. Some of you may have seen the show on Netflix. For those who don't know, an Indian Airlines flight between Kathmandu and Nepal was hijacked and flown all over to Lahore, to Kabul, and finally settled in Kandahar. And it was the first time that, I was watching on television and I saw this government, but they didn't look like government, because government for me were people who wore sort of suits and ties and polished. They were a little more ragtag, wearing guns, and I couldn't make out what this was. And then obviously you see the Indian foreign minister then, Jaswant Singh, the late Jaswant Singh, and now that we know the Indian NSA, Ajit Doval, as part of the negotiations. Back then he wasn't as well known. And you see all the Indian hostages freed, and the Taliban was thanked. And all these reports started coming about how the Taliban's hand in glove. And I'm like, but no, why would the Indian government thank a Taliban government if they're hand in glove with the terrorists? And I think this is the 1990s that became a security concern. And that security concern was obviously ignored from Indian perspective by the West until it became the West problem with 9/11, with Al-Qaeda being sheltered. And today there's a security concern with China. We'll get to the situation with Pakistan, but I think the strategic autonomy means India realizes, look, Afghanistan is too big to ignore. It's not a small country, land masses, very well, right? From Kabul and north to Kandahar and south to Helmand and Herat. And I think there is a belief that, look, India has invested too much into this. Perhaps there is the concern of sunk cost diplomacy, that all these projects India has invested in. There is the relationship with Iran and the Chabahar port in Afghanistan and the neighbor Iran. And there is this, if we don't do anything, China is going to come in here, and Pakistan already wants to come in here. And why don't we continue to engage? And I think that's what you recently saw in the foreign secretary's meeting, Vikram Misri, with the foreign minister of Taliban in Dubai recently, Sadiq.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in every aspect that you mentioned, you talked a lot, and there was a lot there that we could discuss further in details, from the historical ties, cultural ties, trade-wise, and investments that India has done. You mentioned the scholarships. I'm one of the beneficiaries of those scholarships from the Indian government, the ICCR scholarship. I got my bachelor's degree from Bangalore University. And similar, people like me who have come of age because of the investments from India, and they have been invested in this relationship for the past 20 years and more, and all of a sudden being cut off, and then this relationship that as you indicated, there was some contact in the past, but recently they are engaging more frequently because of the security concerns. But all of this other investments that India has done for more than 20 years with Afghans, with women leaders and others who have now all feel alienated. How do you think the Indian leadership justifies that? What is for example, right now, Afghanistan, the catastrophe with respect to the women's situation, right? And of course, Afghanistan does not have democracy. It's a theocracy. It's an Islamic state. It's a terrorist state. And India being the biggest democracy. What do you think the leadership's plan is to work with Afghan women, to work with the youth leaders, to work with their true allies and friends? We can't be like going all the way extreme on this side and then all of a sudden on this side. You can't. How do you think this will work out?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, Sadiq. And I'm glad you mentioned the story of the women. In fact, I went to the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and the former Afghan ambassador to the United States was a woman, as you know very well, and she had the unusual record of being the first Afghan to be granted an H-1B visa. So there are these poignant stories, and I think, Sadiq, you and I, having worked in Washington, D.C. and understand the element of what Fulbright and USA does from an American standpoint, there are things like soft power, people like yourself, a scholar like yourself, who benefited from that, and ergo that generation of Afghans still have, and for many years, have had a fondness for India. In fact, the cultural diplomacy is also very strong. I remember there's a very interesting story. Back in the day, a Reuters report said that robberies in Afghanistan went up because it was a time when people are watching one of the famous case serials, I think between 8 and 8:30. And I think when there was a television store that was stolen, the crooks wrote Tulsi Zindabad, which means long live Tulsi, the protagonist of that show. And because the security guards too were watching the show, that's the whole motto about it. And I think from India's point of view, it's both a case of despondency. But I think if India were to argue this in a court of law, India would probably be like, look, we didn't want the Taliban. India was not the security guarantor for Afghanistan the way the United States was. There's a lot of Washington D.C.'s failed national security apparatus, and as President Biden finishes the last weekend in charge, of the many foreign policy blunders, this, of course, will be right up there, as the national security advisor, the Secretary of State, and will have to be outlining in the memoirs how this was a catastrophic failure, not just a country, not just a government you don't like, but for millions of Afghans, people like yourselves, for posterity. I think India would look like it's unfortunate. We don't recognize them formally. We have to have talks. India would be like, look, we're trying to say. India would probably say, look, we're trying to safeguard the interests of the schools we build. You know, the embassy we have, even though it was shut down after 2021. The roads and the railways, the infrastructure. It's like, look, we don't have enough clout to bring back. No one can turn back the clock and bring back a Karzai government or a Ghani government or anyone else in charge. It's not ideal, especially on the situation right now on women, as you said, and of course, touching on the women's situation. There's a big debate right now, obviously, on women cricketers and Afghanistan as well, the cricket team, the men's cricket team as well. But India would probably be like, there's an element of strategic realism. I don't like that term because I feel it removes the humane element of it. But if at all we have to look at it objectively and just try to assess the foreign policy and its core thing, India would be like, look, it's in Afghanistan, not a small, it's not a tiny country. It's not a drop in the ocean. It's not a it's not a Seychelles. It's not even Sri Lanka. It's far bigger than that. It's a rugged terrain. It's a very important part of the world, sandwiched between Pakistan, a nuclear state, Iran, which is a Shia theocracy. China it has all sort of projects with CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. It's got the Belt and Road Initiative. It's trying to do all this stuff with critical minerals in the sands. India would be like, in the 1990s, we ignored it because of Pakistan. Every time we try to make it in with the Taliban, the Pakistan, the ISI, and the middle establishment would cut off our ties there, cut us at our knees. But today, there is a China factor because there's China that's going to just continue expanding, given China and Iran have a 25-year strategic partnership. India has a Chabad port. So from India's point of view, they'd look at it saying, like, look, it just cautious re-engagement. I would say, to be fair to India, they didn't. Afghanistan fell. The funny thing is, if I remember correctly, so they can correct me on the date, August 15, 2021 is India's Independence Day. August 14, 2021 was Pakistan's Independence Day. And ironically, as two major South Asian countries celebrated their independence, it's Afghans who lost their independence as the Taliban came back to power. And I think India, to be fair to India, they didn't say, okay, let's immediately 1 week later, let's engage, or September. I think it's been 3.5 years, which is a long time, but maybe not a long time in some scheme of things. And India would probably be like, probably touch the water. Let's cautiously re-engage. Perhaps you have to look at it in form of a negotiation to see if at all any of the diaspora that were there have been evacuated out. Just try and say, these are sort of our concerns. We want to continue with the humanitarian aid, which I think India's, as per the press release that came out after Foreign Secretary Ministry met Mutaki, it meant that we want to try and also ensure that we continue for the sake of Afghans. We want to give aid. We want to give a sense of, security, and perhaps more importantly, prevent Afghanistan from falling back into the 1990s trap of all these splinter groups. Because don't forget, like, when the IC-814 hijack happened and one of the terrorists was released, was of course Masood Azhar, and he formed the group Jaish-e-Mohammed. And people obviously think about Pakistan and all these Kashmir groups and Punjabi-based groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba. But a lot of them also had their base in Afghanistan, or they had some training with the Afghan Taliban, such as Jaish-e-Mohammed, the Harkatul Mujahideen, and other groups as well. And India's probably looking at a security concern, saying, look, it's not ideal, but if these guys are guys in charge, and the other people need to carry their cross for how they let Afghanistan and fall the way it is. But if we have to just ensure it, India's perhaps looking very brutally and not. It's ideal again at its own security interests and own strategic interests.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I'm sure there are reasoning and rationale behind what Indians are doing and trying to accomplish in Afghanistan. But from the Afghans' perspective, let me be telling you frankly, as a friend, that there is a sense of betrayal among the community in large. Some people may say it publicly, some may not. But there is a sense of betrayal, a sense of disappointment. They may have complaints from all countries around the world, but they never expected India to shift gears in such a dramatic manner since August 15, 2021. I mean, at least the United States tried to evacuate their allies, tried to help bring out some people, but India didn't even help there, and even cut off the visas for students who are studying in India through those scholarships. And so such mistrust, Afghans have always said, if India and Pakistan could work out their problems, Afghanistan's problem will be resolved. But I don't think Afghans would have expected to see a situation where there would be a second Taliban comeback with the help of the Pakistanis, with the help of the Chinese and Iranians, and India would be also there. That the Pakistanis and India both would be engaging one regime that is clearly having roots and ties to Rawalpindi. But Indians are also trying to build up their rapport with this group, and I'm not sure what's the logic there. But maybe there's something they know that we don't. Hopefully, it wouldn't turn out ugly for India because the Taliban have proven that any country other than their main sponsors, if they have engaged them, they have hurt them, they have stabbed them from the back. And in this process, if you get stabbed by the Taliban and in the process losing your own friends that you have developed in the past 20 years, and if the tomorrow situation change, because the people of Afghanistan are working tirelessly around the world and inside the country to collapse this regime, because we don't want this, and this is unsustainable. This gender apartheid, and so there is a shift that's happening among countries around the world as well, that we're trying to convince for them to back Afghan resistance, political resistance, social resistance, and other types of resistance, so we can get rid of the Taliban. And the new page that will be turned in Afghanistan, what would be India's standing? And how would they look into the eyes of their friends that they've betrayed, basically? It would be something to watch. But what do you think from your perspective? What happened in the Taliban that now they are engaging India? Because they have always been anti-India. What happened there?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, Sadiq. And I completely echo with what you said, because for a lot of Afghans, people like yourself, a lot of Afghans were still in Afghanistan. For a lot of people that we lost touch with, during the evacuation, maybe they went to Albania, maybe they came to Virginia, wherever or maybe still stuck there. Yeah, of course, there's a sense of betrayal. I completely understand that because, as you rightly said, India is the world's largest democracy, and democracy means a pluralistic society, people that stand for not just all faiths, but all people of all sort of genders and all creeds and walks of life. And I think from India's perspective, like just to understand that, because I think the way to, given the Taliban 1.0 and the Taliban 2.0, and I think it's important to understand the Taliban never really went away, because that's the whole fallacy that people forget. The reason why Afghanistan was called graveyard of empires, as you know this very well, is many people never understood Afghanistan. They could never understood the terrain. They never understood the tribe. They never understood that you can't just homogenize Afghanistan. And I think every empire, from Alexander the Great to America, and another modern imperial one, always acted with selfish interests. And I think that was also very well evinced in the 1980s in Charlie Wilson's war. We'll get into that. But I think what I think is happening right now is, I think it's also a shift in the Taliban, not by no means a check mark in the Taliban report card. But the Taliban of the 1990s was a very theocratic, Sunni, hardline group, that Sharia espousing group. In fact, people may forget that the Taliban, as you know very well, and for people who for follow your podcast all know this, I'm sure, but in case there is someone who isn't, the Taliban, of course, means students, and they come from the Deobandi School of Islam, which, of course, has its origins in madrasas in India. So there's that element too. I think the Taliban 2.0, fundamentally from Taliban 1.0, was there's the relationship with Pakistan that's soured. We saw recently on the border skirmishes and the attacks between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And Pakistan is no longer what I think the Taliban 1.0 would have thought. At one point, Taliban 1.0 looked at Pakistan as the security guarantor, the one that had free American money coming in, right? The people from all over, also people in the Congress and the Senate would write all sort of checks to Pakistan because Afghanistan was guarantor. There was this allyship, which still is there. And that also just meant trickle-down effect of Taliban. And of course, given a hardline Islamic government that the Taliban 1.0 was, India was, of course, far and beyond, not just separated by land, but separated by culture and values and a sense of trust. I think Taliban 2.0 wants legitimacy. They want legitimacy. And I think India's power, it's also why India was in the 1990s and where Pakistan was in the 1990s. India's economy may have been ahead, but Pakistan would have hold its own in the security aspect to an extent. But it's also the last 25 years, India is now a $5 trillion economy, overtaking the UK in a very prophetic way of the colony overtaking the empire. It's said to become a G3 economy by 2030 if the data is to be believed. Some people say the G2, G1 at some point. There is the US-India strategic partnership that's there. I think Taliban 1.0 realizes if they have to stay in power, because in some ways, everyone learns from the mistakes of history. If you don't, you're going to doom to repeat it. Taliban 1.0 went in the crosshair of the United States and they got overthrown out of power. And they realized if they need legitimacy, they want to stay in, they need a regional power. And India is a regional power. If India is ready to cut blank checks, maybe not blank checks, but ready to provide the economic aid. And it's important to note that if the economic aid is really going to where it's supposed to go, that's a whole different discussion. The Taliban would want it because, again, there's Taliban 2.0 has smartphones and social media, with Taliban 1.0 doesn't want. And they can craft a better story. We saw the story that Suhail Shaheen put out when Taliban 2.0 took over in 2021, Sadiq, about how it's a different government, how it's going to be a one for all Afghans, how this is the legitimate government. But that's clearly not what you and I believe that's happened. So I think the historic, both the legitimacy and the economic aid, and along with tapping into some form of archaic goodwill that India has for the Afghan people, is I think what Taliban's trying to do. In some ways, Taliban may be a shrewd businessman in some ways. They're trying to get that sort of economic offers going because there's only, if Pakistan is not in the same country to give out that form of security aid that it once could, Taliban has to look elsewhere for it. If it wants to stay in power, it needs a regional influence. And maybe it's a very transactional relationship between India and the Taliban right now. I don't. Obviously, it's not one based on value-based friendship. Far from it, right? It's based on India's security guarantee. These groups don't come about. Pakistan can't extend its octopus arm influence again, and India's sort of saying, but look, we want to care about the Afghan people. We want to care this. We want to continue investing for Afghan posterity in the dams, in the schools, in the hospitals, and perhaps that's where I think the Taliban's like, all right, let's look at it as a win-win. And I use that very sparingly because I think using words like win-win situation is a very facile way to describe the complexities of what's happened.
Yeah, I think a win-win from the Taliban perspective is the Taliban Emirate, Islamic Emirate, with all of their terrorist allies creating this umbrella of terrorism and then unleashing it against all of the non-believers.
Absolutely.
Mark my words. I'm sure there is rationale, there is arguments on why the Taliban shifted, but I think one is precisely the one that you mentioned: the fact that Pakistan is unable to economically provide the necessary means that the Taliban need, and so this time around they've allowed the Taliban to go on seeking funding and resources from anywhere that they can, whether it's from U.S., from China, from Russia, from Iran, or anywhere else. But the truth of the matter is that the Taliban leadership travel around with the Pakistani passports prior to the collapse of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan and their control over the current government. Their families, relatives, all of them live in Pakistan. Their investments are in Pakistan, and the inception, the seed of creation of this group is in Pakistan, and so there's no matter how much India or any other country try to take away or try to see if they could have some influence. They may have some meetings, some photo ops, but when it comes to the real power and influence of having this group, the worldview that they have on how they're going to operate, if they're going to sustain, they are created with the primary purpose of hurting India and countries like India, democracies and liberal states. And I think another aspect to them reaching out to countries like India is the fact that India played a major role in their first Taliban regime with the Afghan resistance, and so they tried to cut off that channel as well to make sure that the only country that could possibly help the liberal Afghans to fight against the Taliban. So they try to take it away from us. But I clearly see there's a win for the Taliban, but I'm not sure how much I try to put my Indian hat as someone who studied in India, I have so much affection and friends and host families in India that I can think like an India, try to think like Indian. I can't see any possibility of any win except a hurting of image globally, regionally, a hurting of Indian image among Afghans. And of course, Indian interest will be undermined, I think, very badly, sadly, in the future if this trajectory goes on. But do you see India, how do you see India-US partnership? Do you think there is an influence there where India is given a green signal by the US to manage the South Asia that includes Afghanistan and the Taliban?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think to look at the India-US relationship, one has to look at it historically. The US-India relationship has gone from a period of aid to trade, from a time when India was dependent on US thing for PL 480 food subsidies, and when India and Indira Gandhi didn't back the US, support in Vietnam, LBJ rolled that back. And of course, the crescendo obviously comes in the 70s and 80s, right? India was obviously not aligned because in the Nehruvian idea of Panchsheel, and when he said Hindi Chini bye bye, that's India China brother brother. People forget this. It's very easy to critique foreign policy, but people forget there are known knowns and known unknowns. At that time, when India got independence, Indian foreign policy was based on the fact that it was a poor country that time, and the British did not just take away India's wealth, but they left India with a whole lot of destitution, uneducated people, unemployed people. A country that lacks self-confidence on a global stage. It was a very Western imperialistic world that, perhaps we still live in. We do still live in that world, no matter what we're talking about other countries. But and I think at that point, nation building at home was important. And Nehru thought, I'm not going to trade once in a Western faces. That the British East India Company, people forget that's the one that came and established colonial rule in India. For another in a Western faces, American capitalism. It's a non-aligned. And a lot of people forget that long before George Bush, America always had a policy of with us or against us. This non-aligned movement was Aero 404 before whatever the computer will look like. They were like, we don't understand because the Cold War left it as in a very Manichaean duopoly, right? There were two power blocks and that's it. Soviet Union or the United States. And Nehru, at that time, in some ways spoke about the Global South before the word Global South was there. It was called Third World at that time, which I don't like using because it's a very imperialistic concept. Emerging market, I like to call it, or newly independent countries. So Nehru from India, Sukarno from Indonesia, Tito from then Yugoslavia, Nasser, Gamal Abdel Nasser from Egypt, and Kwame from Ghana formed this movement. And people forget that India was not a Soviet ally. Such India fundamentally does not. If it's friends with everyone, allies with no one. Perhaps even now the Taliban thing could also be a good example of it. And I think at that time, Pakistan realized, well, hang on a minute. This is interesting. If India is not going to the US camp, let's sign on. And I think Pakistan then had a Parsi diplomat named Jamshed Markar who said, this is perfect. Let's go and get all of Washington's coffers. And I think it's a very interesting story here, Sadiq. The famous journalist Walter Lippmann was having a conversation with John Foster Dulles, whom the airport's named after. And what the Dulles brothers didn't understand in foreign policy, they made up with their bravado. And Lippmann asked Dulles, why do you have East Pakistan, that time East Pakistan, Bangladesh, in Seattle, it's defunct now. They're barely even in Southeast Asia. And he says, because I need the Gurkhas and they can fight. Lippmann's like, wait, what are the Gurkhas that rule Pakistan? He's like, the British tell me the Gurkhas can fight and I need them. He's like, yeah, but what do they rule Pakistan? He's like, they're Muslims from Pakistan. And Lippmann's like, no, they're not. They're Hindus from Nepal. They have nothing to do with Pakistan. And so that's when a lot of the fallacy of the US-Pakistan relationship started. And that comes to fast forward to, Texas congressman named Charlie Wilson. If you don't know him, the book Charlie Wilson's was great, or the movie played by Tom Hanks and Julia Roberts is in it. And I think Om Puri plays Ziaul Haq in it. And Charlie Wilson is just, nobody really knows who he is. This is congressman from Texas 1st District. At a time when Democrats had some say in Texas, but under a very Republican administration of Reagan, and he wants to have some clout and influence. And the moment the Soviets come into Afghanistan, and again, it's the height of the Cold War. People forget that in all of this, India is still at that time now firmly in the Soviet camp because Indira Gandhi and Nixon, the relationship was at a low, the US-India relationship. And people forget in the 1971 war, the war of liberation of Bangladesh, Nixon and Kissinger publicly backed East Pakistan Gary Bass's book, Blood Telegrams, is very good to show the genocide happening in East Pakistan, and and they looked away, Nixon and Kissinger, which is why the relationships were at a low when Nixon even threatened to send, I think, the Sixth Fleet to India, and Indira Gandhi called his bluff. And at that time, when the Soviet Union invaded into Afghanistan, again, this was a time of building on empires, building on client state, which is why it's called the Cold War. It was all about building these client states across Central America, Africa, and Afghanistan fell into the Soviet camp. And all of a sudden, Charlie Wilson was like, hang on, I want to be relevant. And he decided that the best way to beat the mighty Red Army is obviously not to get involved directly, otherwise it would not be a Cold War, is to find all these ragtag, warriors, and which became known as the Mujahideens. And Pakistan being an ally, the ISI all of a sudden was a funding agency. So Zia-ul-Haq, what became a squalid dictator who should have been ostracized by Washington, D.C. for Islamicizing Pakistan, for public flogging, for all his very radical views, and a military dictator who assassinated a prime minister, suddenly became this blue-eyed boy for all of the even Jimmy Carter first started with Zbigniew Brzezinski. Said, hold on a minute, we need these guys. And then the Reagan era took it to a whole new level. And then the ISI was in good graces. The Mujahideen got all this. And among all the Mujahideen warlords, as you know very well, was a Saudi engineer named Osama bin Laden, who was in Afghanistan and all of a sudden a hero. And then I think when all of that happened, when the Soviet Union finally collapsed, Charlie Wilson almost said, oh, when the Soviet Union leaves, we'll buy the Mujahideen for a price of sheep. Very imperialistic way. And I don't know how accurate the movie was in this thing, but he did try to ask Congress for more funding. After spending billions of dollars, he asked for $1 million in aid, which is pittance and wouldn't really cover all the damage. They're like, nobody cares about Pakistan. And he's like, but Afghanistan. And he said, the exact line was, we may be the good guys, but they don't get a copy of the New York Times to know that. And I think Benazir Bhutto at that time, when she had come into power in 1990s, pointed out that, Mr. President, I think she told, it was Bush that time, you've created a Frankenstein because you put all these warlords in Afghanistan. You brought them from all sort of parts, from all sort of Central Asian parts, and you brought Bin Laden from Saudi Arabia, and you gave them all these fancy toys and guns and grenades, and you left on the first bus out. What do you think was going to happen? They were not going to be the good Samaritan to build schools and colleges. They won a war the only way they know how, and they will continue to govern the only way they know how. And they coalesced, they became the Taliban, as you know well. And long before Taliban, Hekmatyar was there, and the Pakistanis were like, well, hold on a minute. If we can beat the mighty Red Army, death by 1,000 cuts, India. Because the 71 war was still very scarring for Pakistan, and Zia-ul-Haq was very much part of that. They're like, well, we can do this slowly and slowly, the way Bangladesh happened. So the way India trained the Mukti Bahini, let's send them to Kashmir. And that's also when the insurgency starts in Kashmir. And Clinton 1.0 and India were firmly on different sides. Robin Raphael, then the Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asia, I think the first one to hold that office, menaced India in a lot of ways. And then India had the nuclear tests, and then, of course, US-India relations were another. But within a decade, the civil nuclear deal was signed and US-India relations grew. And at a time when India and Pakistan were not hyphenated, because another military dictator in Pakistan, in Parvez Musharraf, comes about. And again, what should have been ostracized. Two things what the two military dictators had in common, Zia-ul-Haq and Musharraf. Afghanistan became important. For Zia-ul-Haq, it became because of the Soviet Union. For Musharraf, it was the post-9/11 era. And all of a sudden, the Richard Holbrooke AFPAC playbook becomes most important. And as a result of which, the US-India relationship was still very thorny, but after the civil nuclear deal, it continued to grow. And the US-India relationship also grew when the Pakistan element faded. A couple of things happened. One is the Bombay terror attacks of 2008, aided and abetted by the ISI with the Lashkar-e-Toiba. And 2011, that same Saudi engineer named Osama bin Laden, as you touched on, Sadiq, was found in Abbottabad, Pakistan, 60 kilometers from Islamabad, in front of the Kabul Military Academy, there at West Point. And someone somewhere knew something at some point. And all of a sudden, the US-Pakistan relationship, it's another. India's economy is obviously very important. It grows, continues to grow. There is a strategic counterweight with China. There is a large consumer market for American goods. There is a shared values that they share. So the US-India relationship was based on a three-legged stool: the strategic relationship on defense, trade, security. There's a shared democratic values. But most importantly, the people-to-people element, the Indian diaspora element, the fact that you have Silicon Valley CEOs, the fact that you have the Indian doctor, the fact that you have the spelling bee champion, all of this has codified the image of the moderate minority. And as a result of which, right now, it's also where China is. In post 2011, China under Xi Jinping or 2012 under Xi Jinping is fundamentally different. So there's a US-India convergence because the elephant in the room is a dragon. And the dragon element, you see a lot of it in the Quad coalescing on the Indo-Pacific. But there's also the other element, like which is why you have IMEC and I2U2. And Afghanistan, not exactly in that area, but it's in the neighborhood. And I think that's where the US-India relationship converts. Sorry to go a little round about it, but I thought the history is important to understand the current context. So the long story short is the elephant in the room is a dragon. There's a US-India partnership to prevent China from getting a stronghold in that element. And of course, there's always unstable Pakistan that keeps everyone up at night.
Yes, absolutely. That was great. Background information with a lot of information, a lot of details that I'm sure our viewers will appreciate. You mentioned the dragon factor. We know that is there. And that is the justification that is given by the Indian leadership for engaging the Taliban, the justification from the U.S. leadership and other countries as well. But there's another aspect also, which is the terrorism that has never gone away, despite the fact that democratic leadership in the U.S. tried to indicate as if it's gone away. It's now in different countries. But Ayman al-Zawahiri was found in Kabul. He was killed there, and despite all of the information that are being spread out as if there was some cooperation from the Taliban, but we know it was a unilateral operation that was conducted by the U.S. Special Forces to take out this Taliban, the terrorist leader, the most wanted terrorist leader in the world in Kabul. And of course, the replacement is also reportedly between Afghanistan and Iran. And all of the terrorist organizations that you mentioned, from Jaish-e-Mohammed, Lashkar, and others, all have offices, all have representatives in Kabul, and they are in consultation. And all of them pledge allegiance to the Taliban leader. All of the terrorists, even ISIS-K, it's not mentioned publicly, but privately they have pledged allegiance to the Taliban leader. It doesn't matter which terrorist group anywhere on the planet, from Hamas to Hezbollah, everybody. The Taliban leader is the one, for at least from the Sunni aspect of it. And we know from the Shia, all of those groups pledge allegiance to the Iranian leader. So given that factor, do you see U.S.-India being concerned from terrorism? There's an area of cooperation between the two countries to focus on countering threat of terrorism from Afghanistan?
Oh, 100%. In fact, one of the reasons not to repeat myself, but to kind of touch on, I think the phrase we use in US-India relationship a lot is hesitation of history, because there was 50 years of baggage in the 77-year relationship and the last 2.5 decades of great relations. There's a hesitation of history that India has with Afghanistan, particularly with the Taliban, right? Because the Taliban 1.0 there was no relations, there was a menace element, there was the IC-814 hijacking, there were, firmly in the Pakistan camp, all these terror groups were there. If anything, India may lose a little bit of the thorny issues creeping up between the current Pakistan element and the Taliban right now, to be like, hang on a minute, there is no Pakistan nexus as strong as it was. There is security concern we have that we don't want, because the fundamental thing for any threat, be it archaic terrorism or modern day cyber, you don't know what the next threat looks like. And again, that's a very important element to understand history, right? Because the US was so obsessed with the Cold War beating the Soviet Union, you didn't understand non-nation nuclear states that could possess a form of weaponry that could attack the homeland. The Soviet Union never attacked the US homeland. Al-Qaeda did, sitting from Afghanistan. And one would say it's hard to prognosticate that, but there are fundamental elements to know that if you don't have shared values with such groups, why would you abet them? Right? And I think that's that element as well, to try and prevent. If anything, maybe if at all, if I had to be the most optimistic defense counsel for the Indian foreign policy established right now, it would be perhaps preventing a group that could be so radical that we don't know. Because even again with Iraq, when the US invaded Iraq, and all about Saddam and WMD, which we clearly now, even the biggest American hawk or someone in the Dick Cheney camp would tell you that was not the case right now, removed Saddam Hussein, what happened? You created a political vacuum. You created lacunas. You had a Sunni leader in charge of a Shia majority. That happened. And you had all these other Shia groups come about. And all of a sudden, the Sunnis felt ostracized, and the group formed named the Islamic State of Levant and Iraq and Syria, and that came about. And that was far worse than what we saw with Al Qaeda. And in some ways, one would argue that Taliban and ISIS Khorasan are loggerheads because the Taliban wants governance, ISIS Khorasan just wants a caliphate, as they're publicly stated. Um, I think there is a concern both the US and India have on what radical groups look like. They disagreed on these radical groups for many years because Pakistan was very firmly an ally of the United States. And again, the US, of course, used what they'd call pragmatic policy, but one would argue selfish interests of the Afghanistan factor and the Soviet Union factor in Afghanistan, and then the post factor flush of Taliban that they needed a Pakistan established, they needed an ally, they needed bases. People forget when Francis Gary Powers' flight was shot down, U-2 was shot down, he took off from Peshawar. So there, all these bases very much existed. It's because the US-Pakistan relationship changed. It's because Pakistan is no longer what it is. It's in a political, economic morass of its own making, right? That there is now an Afghan Taliban that's come back, that's sort of like Rip and Winkle, woken up after 20 years. Like, okay, now I'm back there, but this looks familiar but not familiar. There's a Pakistan that's not exactly an ally. The world has changed. There's a United States that doesn't want to be part of this, so there's no point going, hammer and tongs and bringing down this American imperialism. There's the India that's now a strong regional player that, if we're getting money that comes from it, how does it matter? And I think that's where the Taliban looking at it from the US-India perspective is definitely a concern. I don't think the United States is looking at Afghanistan anymore because the way they did when they left in the 1990s, it's like washing your hands off, which is, of course, is a very, very cardinal thing to do, especially after being there for 20 years and promising Afghans a better future. Jettisoning the way they jettisoned was, it's created the situation that we're in right now. And I think where we look at it right now is Washington has got so much on its plate. We won't even get to the new elections, the new president coming in, because I'm sure that'll come up in your further questions. But I'll say this, that just last point on this is with the war in Ukraine, with the situation in the Middle East, Washington's entanglements are far too much that Afghanistan, Bangladesh, it's just obviously the desk and State Department and defense teams in the Pentagon are looking at this, but not the same way that it's a priority for the Oval Office.
Yeah. I mean, the reason I asked was, the recent years there was, before the collapse of the Islamic Republic, there was an initiative by the Afghanistan government to have U.S.-India, and trilateral forums where they would try to speak. Afghanistan being the youngest democracy in the region, and India being the biggest democracy, and of course, U.S. being the oldest democracy. The to speak with each other on how to sustain and make sure this democracy survives in that geography. Unfortunately, the initiative didn't bear fruit, and we lost the young democracy in that region. Hopefully, we'll regain it. But with respect to some of the observations that you had on terrorist groups, since ISIS, K, and others, they make Taliban look better. If you look at it, and sometimes you wonder if that was their strategy. That was part of the strategy to create this other worse Sunni extreme group, so that the Taliban become more acceptable to the regional and international stakeholders, for them to engage them, for them to negotiate with them, and to talk with them and see if there's a possibility to work with them. And we saw what happened. The international community was forced to leave Afghanistan. If there was some level of trust, if they really trusted this new entity and group, they wouldn't have left. And the reason that they have left is because probably they realized that, as they were busy in Ukraine, as they were thinking that they would get busy in Ukraine and other places, they thought they could, cut some of their engagement level from Afghanistan. But what I'm worried about is that ISIS-K and Taliban and all of these terrorist groups basically bear different sides of the same coin. And particularly ISIS-K and Taliban. And given the fact that the Taliban are operationally as strategically created by Pakistan, operationally they're being managed by ISI officers. They have also been handed over, because Pakistanis are faced with shortage of cash, they're also handed over to the Iranians, to the IRGC, which is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran, that they are also managing the Taliban, and particularly the Taliban leadership's office. I think from that aspect, given you mentioned the 25-year strategic partnership with China, IRGC's contract and agreement with Putin of Russia. So I think the acts of evil has formed up themselves, and the Taliban the recapturing of Afghanistan was basically the first act of this axis of evil against the liberal states. And I think India is in a very tricky situation because they are having ties with the Iranian regime that is being right now ostracized by the international community, and there's a lot of sanctions, there's a lot of pressure, and I'm sure that pressure will keep building up. And I think that that's based on the confidence of Iranians and facilitation of the Iranians. The Indians have started engaging the Taliban with the hope that maybe they could also gain some leverage through this engagement, and the U.S. looking at India, feeling like, oh, if India could do something, maybe we could do it. So I think that web, that optimistic web, that is basically a trap for India, for United States, and for the West. I hope that we will not get caught in that we will soon realize that this is a trap by the Chinese, this is a trap by the Russians and by the Iranians. But let's shift the gear a little bit, come back to the US side. Do you foresee a change of the US foreign policy towards Afghanistan with the new administration? And do you think that would change India's approach towards Afghanistan as well?
Sadiq, I think when it's very hard to read the tea leaves, the one thing I can say with confidence is predictability. Unpredictability is the only predictability with the Trump administration. And I said this with the Taliban, I'll say this for the Trump administration, is Hollywood tells us the sequels are always far worse than the original, because we saw what Trump 1.0 looked like. In some ways, Trump 1.0 was very opposite of everything we know in US foreign policy. US hegemonic belief was always that, look, in the Mearsheimer context of great powers, you and the United States always were like, if something is against, if something espouses communism, if there are these groups we don't like, we'll go after them. I don't know if I can say these words on your show, if it's a friendly show, but FDR had once had this thing of, he may be an SOB, but he's our SOB, so that's why the United States always had these little nexus groups. But Trump didn't want any of that. Trump always spoke about, you know what, I'm going to get Borisov. I'm going to talk to strongmen. So I'm going to talk to Putin. I'm going to talk to Kim Jong-un. He called him Little Rocket Man, but he spoke to everyone. Said, I'm going to get deal done with China. And NAFTA is a bad deal. All of that he made the transactions. And I'll get this solved. Don't forget, this current peace deal that we had was under the Trump administration 1.0 that started engineering it when, before when the Trump administration thought they could just go to Doha and Qatar and just get this all very well sorted and done, long before Tom West, his predecessor, thought that, well, I'll just go and just speak to them and get something done and get it all sorted out. I think Trump 1.0 thinks that by just doing these little quick deals, this New York real estate type deals, that you could solve foreign policy. And foreign policy is not just getting two people to agree on a sheet of paper. It puts in a lot of historical baggage, because history has never been even. Like, they always say the phrase, all things being equal. They're not. They never have been. There's historical baggage. There's cultural linkages. There's religious tensions. There's ethnic and demographic groups. And there's all of that with economic interests. So simply looking at it just from the economic perspective negates all of that. I think that's what the Trump administration missed out on doing. And they thought that they could just get this quick deal, fixed deal done. So on one hand, I would say with Trump 2.0, I don't see Trump getting more involved. In some ways, he's been very, ironically, very not interventionist, he's been more isolationist. And he wants to try and pull back on it and doesn't want the United States involved in all these conflicts. Afghanistan was the longest war and overtook Iraq. And I think the fatigue factor just sort of set in. They just want to be like, we don't care where it's at. Afghan, it's your problem. We've tried our best. Off we go. Graveyard empires, check. In some ways, it seems like that, right? And I think Trump doesn't want any more to do with Afghanistan. That being said, his value systems are very different from what the traditional American president value system is. Because American presidents, while America puts up one person on a pedestal on the Oval Office, but it's also a big system. There's a military-industrial complex. There are people behind the policies that most people never get to know of, right? And, from everyone who works in the National Security Council to the State Department desk to the Defense Department desk to a bunch of stakeholders to defense contractors and everyone else that puts it. And the president, of course, is the face of the policy, but the policy is a big, complicated machinery, like an economy. No one president does one thing and gets the economy better. It's a whole engine room that goes together. But under Trump, he sort of wants to operate like he's excuse me, please. he sort of wants to operate like he's the one person in charge. And it's in some ways, Trump is sort of the final say on a Trump administration foreign policy. And if he kind of believes that I can have a deal with the Taliban, he'll come and have a deal with Taliban. Does that mean more golf courses and more Trump towers? Well, that's anyone's guess. Uh, but he is not averse to talking to people that the Washington establishment would call, both Democrats and Republicans would revile ad nauseum, like a Vladimir Putin, like a Kim Jong Un. I mean, it's heresy to think you can even go and speak to North Korea. It's one of the most archaic hermit kingdoms, communist, Soviet camp, Russian camp backed countries. And to think that you will just go hand in glove and meet Kim Jong Un, not once, twice, maybe. And so Donald Trump itself is so capricious. So there's the Trump playbook is only known by Trump. And the best part is I don't think the Trump playbook for the second term is written because Donald Trump does not know what he's going to write in it.
Yeah, yeah, and we're very hopeful actually. Afghans are very hopeful because he has already tested the negotiation and talks because he's the guy to make deals, and that deal didn't work. He basically got a piece of paper which he later claimed that it wasn't worth it, that he is no longer liking that document, that agreement that was signed, and of course the way it was managed and pulled off, it wasn't. And the guy who negotiated is being seen very badly by Trump and his circle. And so the new team that is around him, they are familiar with the situation, and we are hoping that they understand this web of deceit by the axis of evil through their re-emergence of the Taliban as an umbrella terrorist group that they could unleash against the West and liberal states through an asymmetric warfare. So maybe from that lens, they would be paying attention on Afghanistan. And also, of course, the Iranian angle is there because the necessary preparations are being made to make sure that this regime should not last in Iran. And given the fact that the Iranian regime is in bed with the Taliban, and I think that in that calculation, they will also be included. So let's see. I mean, as you indicated, Trump is very unpredictable. But we are hoping that hopefully they will be tough on Taliban, particularly on how they're dealing and handling with the Afghans and particularly the women of Afghanistan. Hopefully, it would get to Trump to freeing more than 20 million Afghan women and girls might be a big achievement for him. And if he could do that, that he could achieve that and get rid of the Taliban and reestablish a democratic system in Afghanistan, but maybe that will end up getting him a Nobel Peace Prize. Hopefully, maybe that would encourage him to have a different approach towards Afghanistan. So let's see what will happen. I mean, Joe, it was really fascinating to speak with you. I'm really enjoying this conversation, but we need to keep the show to an hour. But that doesn't mean that we will not talk again. We'll definitely bring you back in other contexts and other conversations. We can further explore on various aspects, especially the historical details and descriptions that you provided on various relationships. So we'll get you back. So we'll get your feedback on this, but maybe at the end you could have your message to the international community. What do you recommend the international community, the world, should adopt an approach towards Afghanistan?
There's an amazing story. I was covering the 2015 World Cup in Australia, and I remember this game. Afghanistan, Scotland, I think Shapur Zardan hit the winning runs and ran with his arms like that. It was one of the first time I think most people had seen an Afghan victory, that too in the World Cup. Yes, Scotland, not a cricket power as such, but that since then there were all these amazing novels spoken about, like of Afghan heroes, like not Superman and Spider-Man and Marvels and DC Comics, but Afghans who overcame strife, who grew up in refugee camps on the border, who overcame temptation of hashish and went the way. And Shapur Zardan is one of those as a hero, and that created the pathway for so many Afghans right now playing the game. And then in the 2023 World Cup, when I remember, I think I texted you this, Sadiq, when Afghanistan beat England after everyone thought England's going to win this. I said, graveyard of cricket empires now. And I was so hopeful they beat Australia, and I think they almost had it, but beating so many other countries, beating Pakistan. And I almost said, if only the US and Russia played cricket and Afghanistan could beat them, that would be very historical justice. But that's my message in the sense that what I've come to see with Afghanistan is a country that had suffered so much, multiple generations have suffered, like from your father's generation to your generation to the generation of your child, Sadiq. Um, and there's still people who've come through because the Afghan spirit, like its terrain, is one of it's rugged. It's very soft people, but very tough people. And it's people who are able to overcome adversity. Because when you've only grown up with a sense of adversity, when you've only grown up with great colonial powers, imperial powers coming and spreading your country like a cheese, you toughen up. There's always been a warmth of Afghan people, but a very tough exterior. And I think that's phenomenal. And there's a big debate right now, should countries boycott Afghanistan? Yes, there's the Islamic Emirate Empire, there's Taliban, but I think there's also a cricket side of me that thinks about, if anything, this you're helping future Afghans. You're helping give a story of hope, because sometimes sport helps that. Invictus, even though apartheid ended in South Africa, and the Springbok may have been redolent of the Afrikaner South Africans, but it sort of brought a country together. And I'm hoping more Afghan cricket brings more Afghans together. It brings more, but I don't think the Taliban banning Afghan women cricketers from playing is going to be there. But I'm hoping that, I think the story is always going to be the Afghan people. There's always going to be a fondness of Afghan people, irrespective of who's in charge. And I think my hope is, I've only got to know some amazing Afghans, people like yourselves, people like my friend Lima, who lost her sister, Natasha, in IED blast. Afghan food with so similar to the Indian cuisine, from pulao to sabzis to everything else. And I just think there's the diaspora of Afghans that are so strong and will continue telling the story of Afghanistan the way it's meant to be told. Not the Taliban, not any other government, because people tell stories better than governments.
Well, thank you, Akshobh. You're a true friend of Afghanistan. We're glad to have you. I mean, you talked about in sports trying to beat. Afghans would jump in on any opportunity to beat the Russians any day, even today, because of their relationship and their backing of the Taliban. And I think the pro-democracy Afghans would want to beat Indians as well. they're very keen in challenging India as well for their engagement, because they don't like seeing Indian diplomats hanging out with the Taliban, frankly.
You'll be
So
surprised, except for a Mohammad Shami hat trick. I think for sport it's wonderful. I was hoping Afghanistan beat India because it's beautiful for sport. Want to see an underdog do well, but yeah, thank you, Sadiq.
thank you so much. Well, glad to have you, Akshobh. This was Akshobh Giridharadas, a former journalist, geopolitical analyst, and a keen observer of the situation in Afghanistan, an expert on India-US relationship, a real asset for us in Washington, D.C. A very thoughtful and insightful guy. Glad to have you. Thank you very much for the opportunity. So to all of our viewers, this was our episode. This was our show. Until the next one, God bless you. God bless Afghanistan. God bless India. God bless United States. And God bless our world. Thank you.
Thank you, Sadiq.